Hey, welcome back. It's good to have you joining us today. We're on week 18 of our Undivided Bible Study series. We've been looking at the life stories of Elijah and now Elisha this year. And I don't know about you, but I sure have enjoyed it. Every week there's a new story, and I feel like God has so much more than I even anticipated he would have. It just keeps getting better and better. So I hope you've been enjoying it. We're glad to have you going along with us. And so today we're going to be looking at 2 Kings 5. We have this incredible story of a man named Naaman from another country, from Syria actually, in the country of Aram, or Aram, however you say that, from what the scriptures say. But that's actually in modern day Syria. And Israel has had dealings with them before. This is not the first time that they have interacted. So if you've been on this journey with us over the last several months, maybe you remember some of those stories. Do you remember when we first met the king of Aram, or Aram, in Syria? His name is Ben-Hadad, and we saw him way back in 1 Kings. Do you remember that with Elijah? You go back to the files in your brain couple months ago, there was this battle between Ben-Hadad, the king of Samaria, who had border towns along Israel on the northern part, and they were fighting over those border towns. And we saw that this was actually one of the stories where Ahab is given mercy. God grants him victory over Ben-Hadad. If you remember, he captures him and he brings him up into his chariot instead of destroying him.
Oh, that's right.
Do you remember that? And he was supposed to destroy all of the soldiers and wipe out the entire army. And God said, I will hand over the king of Aram to you. And instead, he makes a treaty with him. And so he makes this deal. The king says, I'll give you free access to our marketplaces, and we'll have trade happening if you will spare my life. And he agrees, and he makes this terrible mistake when God would have just defeated his enemy right then. But he doesn't. Ahab makes that bad choice, and he ends up making a treaty, and Ben-Hadad actually does not follow through and give him those border towns, and so he goes back to war with him. And when he goes back to war, this time it's with Jehoshaphat. You remember? It was Jehoshaphat's first battle, and Jehoshaphat said, I will go with you, Ahab, but let's find out what the Lord has to say. And so they call in Elijah. And what does Elijah tell them? He says, if you go into battle, you are not coming back. And they don't believe, right? And he says to him back then, you will know. You will know who is God if you come back. Mark my words, all you people. Actually, I made a mistake. I don't think this was Elijah. The second time it was Micaiah that they call in. And nobody believes him. And he says, mark my words. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah. He was the one that was blunt and said he didn't care what anybody thought. He just said it.
He just said it. And so what happens is Ahab dies. But before he dies, Jehoshaphat goes into battle dressed in his kingly garb. Ahab disguises himself so that he won't be targeted. But this doesn't fool God. If you remember, Ben-Hadad actually gives the order, don't worry about anybody else. I want you to hunt down and kill Ahab. And so the entire army is looking for Ahab, and they see Jehoshaphat in all of his royal robes, and they start chasing after him thinking that he's Ahab. And when they realize that he's not, they turn around, and Ahab does get killed, but by a stray arrow, random arrow.
Oh, that one arrow.
That we know is not random.
No.
Right?
It was placed there by God.
Yes, absolutely.
His time was done.
His time was done. So you can see there's been this history of tension between these two countries, and it stems really from the very beginning back here when God said, he gave him victory, and he said, I'll give you the king, and you will know that I am the Lord. And then he does, but Ahab makes that choice not to follow through. And he lets his enemy go. And we see that this king and this country continue to plague the Israelites for years and years afterwards. Elijah probably ministered for about 20 years publicly in Israel. And he's now gone up to heaven, and now Elisha has succeeded him as prophet in Israel, and it's been some years since then. And so they're still having this tension happening. And here we see a story, not necessarily with the king, Ben-Hadad. We'll see that in next week's story. But this story is fallout from a commander in the Syrian army. And it makes me wonder, was Naaman there at that battle with Ahab? Was he one of the commanding officers? Had he pursued him? Had he been a part of all of this? I think it's very probable that he probably was, and he's had this history with Israel. And we see in the very beginning of this chapter, just a few verses, it gives you an idea of the tension that's been happening between these two countries. Because now it says that Naaman was a commander of the army of the king of Aram, which is Ben-Hadad. That's his master. And that he was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. And now listen to this. Now bands from Aram had gone out and taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. So interesting, since that time it tells us that now the tensions have continued. And even when there's not national wars going on between Israel and Aram, there are bands of raiders that are coming into Israel, and they're stealing maybe crops or cattle or horses, people, and they have abducted this young Jewish girl from one of the towns in Israel. And so what I want us to do today is to look through this story by looking at the people in the story and looking at what can we learn about the Lord. Definitely, this is a story of healing, a big story of healing that's obvious from Naaman and what happens to him, and it's pretty miraculous. And I'm excited to jump into it with you. But I also want us to notice that it's not just about Naaman, it's actually about this young girl. We have a king of Israel, we have the prophet Elisha, we have a servant Gehazi, and there's healing available for each of these characters. Now, one of the things that we have asked you to do, if you are following along in our Bible study with your journal and your handouts, is we have asked you to look at 3 questions during the week before you come to Bible study. And one of the things we suggest that you do is when you're reading the first day is really just look at the story, look at the details, but also look at the characters. What do you learn about the characters, the main players of the story here? And this becomes into an important piece of the story and understanding what God is doing in the lives of these very different people from very different places. And it helps us to understand how God deals with each of them in their own specific area and challenges us to really examine who do we identify with. And so we want to do that together today with you and just encourage you to keep doing that as you go along. So our big idea today, like I said, it's a story of healing. And the big idea is that an undivided heart follows God's path for healing. God knows exactly what we need, and he wants to heal those wounds that we have. But we have to believe him, and we have to walk in it. And we're going to look at these 4 characters and see how did they respond to God and his path for healing in their life. So if you have your handouts, we want to look at the first point. We want to look at this kidnapped girl. And I think it's extraordinary that even though she's only given a few verses in the beginning, it's extraordinary to find this young girl who has been violently abducted from her family by these Syrian raiders who've come to her house, who have forcefully kidnapped her, stolen her from her family, treated her as property, really. In today's world, we'd call that human trafficking, right? And we fight against that, and we raise money, and we arrest people, and it's a big problem even today. And so this is what they did, and I don't know exactly what happened to her. The Bible doesn't give us details, but I would assume that it was a violent taking of her. And we know how foreigners might treat young women and the things that they might that do to them. And I don't know what her story is, but I do know that it's had to cause an immense amount of grief in her life, a violation of her human rights, the emotional damage that happens when innocence is taken, when you're violated, when you're ripped away from a family that in a homeland that you've known and treated as property and placed in a foreign country alone.
To just serve.
To serve,
Yes.
right? Just the grief and the loss on her part, but thinking about her family, right? Can you imagine the prayers that her family, her parents might have prayed for God's mercy upon her, that he might return her home, that his hand would be present with her and helping her when they could not be. The amount of trust in God that they would have to have, not knowing where she's at or what's happening to her, and her being in a foreign country, the amount of pain that would cause you as a parent. And yet we see that God has allowed this event in her life and her family's life for a purpose. And he heard her parents' prayer, even though he answered it in a different way. You know, they were praying for God's mercy maybe upon her. And he doesn't bring her home, but he does show incredible mercy in her life. And he gives her this incredible peace in his story of redemption and mercy in somebody else's life, a foreigner who doesn't deserve it, someone who's taken her captive, certainly somebody who's done her wrong. And yet God uses her to turn the tables. And so the extraordinary thing that I think about is, how does a girl who's undergone this kind of trauma, how does she have a heart that can be compassionate for her captor? How does that happen? That's not natural.
It's like loving your enemies.
Yes.
Which is what he wants us to do. But
yes,
so
and this
hard.
is not just somebody you don't really like. This is somebody who has wronged you severely and maybe doesn't even recognize that, is not admitting their fault in it. And so how can a heart that is justifiably angry and hurt not become bitter, but become compassionate?
Yeah.
How does that happen? It has to be supernatural, right? That kind of healing only comes from the Holy Spirit, from the Lord who grants it in his mercy. It doesn't come naturally, right? And so we want to look at the compassion of this kidnapped girl, that somehow in his mercy, God softens her heart towards her captor, that he allows her to see past his sin, to see past his pride, and instead see his pain. And he allows her to have compassion on him so that she even suggests, you know, if my master would just go to Samaria, to the prophet there, he would be healed. That she would actually work towards his healing, that she would desire his healing, is totally from the Lord. And I think it's only possible because of her willingness to forgive. And that's the other line underneath on your handout. We want to understand the compassion of this kidnapped girl, this abducted girl, can only come from her willingness to forgive him and entrust that to the Lord, entrust his judgment or his mercy to the Lord. And here she's just serving. She's such an insignificant young slave girl in a foreign house, and yet God raises her up to have influence with the commander of the Syrian army. That's pretty incredible that God does that. And he allows her to experience these things so that he can do a work in and through her to this foreign commander who would otherwise not know him, who would otherwise not repent of his sin, who would otherwise not be a changed man. And so I think it's just incredible that although we don't get the details, that this anonymous girl is raised up and honored and given this piece in this story, this piece of influence that only comes from the Lord. Isn't that incredible?
Yes, so no matter how small or insignificant we think we are, God can use us.
Yes.
In places that we don't even understand.
Right.
So, children also.
Yes.
She was actually a child.
Absolutely. And that he can use our greatest misery and our greatest pain to serve his purposes. that he can soften our heart and make it compassionate, where we only feel hardness and anger and resentment and bitterness, that he can do this supernatural work in our hearts too. For those of you who have felt that pain of being violated, being wronged, and that anger, that natural anger that rises up, and it's a just anger. What he did was wrong, or what she did was wrong. And yet the release of that to the Lord actually brings healing, and allowing him to have his way will bring us healing. Now, what did you think of this commander Naaman, and the description of him and who he is and how he responds? What was your take?
Well, obviously he was a pretty proud commander and demanded control, and no one told him what to do.
No.
He was obviously in charge and demanded respect, and that's the way it was.
Yes.
So he wasn't real humble.
Right?
No.
And that's really our first point, the pride of a commander,
There's
right?
The pride.
Look at how the words they describe him: highly regarded. He was victorious. He was a valiant soldier. He had power. He had position. He had prestige. He was successful in battle. He probably led some of those raids. He probably was in battle with them. He was brave. He was admired. He was a hero among his people. He was envied. And yet the last descriptor is that he was also full of leprosy. And so we see that all of these things don't matter if you have this cancer, this leprosy that will take your life eventually. It doesn't seem that it has progressed that far yet. He has a spot, but he knows where it will go. And so we see that God uses this death sentence, really, this leprosy, to do an amazing work of healing, and to be the one thing that brings him the most hope in his life, the most freedom in his life. And so we see that God has a plan for Naaman. He doesn't know it yet. He's leprous. He's prideful. So he's got not just the outside sickness, but his heart is sick. He doesn't know God. And so God sees the need to humble him, right? And Naaman's going to experience this, that he has a need to humble himself. And this is going to be his first lesson. And that's the blank on your handout. Number 2, the pride of a commander. We're going to see that he's going to find out about his need to humble himself. He needs to find it interesting that a commander will actually listen to the instructions of a slave girl, right? This is the very beginning of the
his
humbling.
wife.
And his wife,
Because
right?
she told the wife.
Yes.
You know, women have a big influence on men.
We do.
Yes, we have to know that God put us there for a reason.
As a
it's
helpmate.
like his Holy Spirit speaks through us to our husbands.
Yes. And he uses our husbands with us, and we have to
yes, it goes 2 ways.
Yes. Yes.
You're right.
But in that culture, that was very significant, because women were not given the value that God gives women.
That's right.
And so he was willing to listen to his wife, to this servant girl, and we're going to see later God, he has to listen to servants later on in the story, right? When he refuses to follow God's plan. So the third group of people we want to look at, do you remember Naaman goes to the king, his own king, to Ben-Hadad, and he asks for letters to be sent so that he can go to Israel, to Samaria, and find this prophet who can heal him. And his king says, by all means, go. I'm going to send letters with you. And so Naaman shows up at the palace in Samaria with King Joram. And King Joram's response is one of panic. And he says, who am I? I'm not God. I can't raise to life or cause death to happen. I don't do those things. In fact, in Deuteronomy 32, that's how God describes himself. Deuteronomy 32:29. Joram is very familiar with God and how he describes himself. He says, that must be a typo. But he says, I am God, I raise to life, and I cause death, and I will raise to life again. I will put in the notes the correct reference for that. And he knows that, and he quotes that. And he says, I'm not God, I can't do that. And he panics because he doesn't have a relationship with God. And yet we see Elisha, when he hears about this, he says, send him over here. And he's going to know that there's a prophet in Israel. Well, what he's saying is not just about him, but he's saying he's going to know that the living God lives here and that he speaks through his people, his prophets. And the king responds differently. He sees a crisis because he has no relationship with God. But Elisha sees an opportunity in it. He sees an opportunity because he knows God is present. He knows God has orchestrated all of this. And he's confident that God is working in all of that. And that's the blank on the line just underneath point 3, the reactions of a king and prophet. The difference is their ability to trust that God is working. And so how do we see situations? Do we see situations as a crisis? Do we walk into it with fear and panic and looking at what we are going to do to handle this? Or do we walk into a situation knowing that God has orchestrated this opportunity to demonstrate who he is to the people and to us? And so we want to walk like Elisha in the confidence that God is always working. He's working in the leprosy. He's working in the pain of his slave girl. He's working in the bringing of a foreigner into your land, somebody with tensions, right? Ongoing tension between them. God is in the midst of all of this. And so whatever you're going through, I want you to understand that God is in the middle of it. There's an opportunity for you in this. There's an opportunity for God to work, and we don't want to miss that. We want to grab hold of that, right?
And we often don't obviously see what he's doing, but just trusting.
Yes.
This is all happening, and it will work out some way for some good.
Yes, absolutely. So we want to look at what is this path to healing? What were the instructions that Elisha gives him? Naaman then travels to Elisha's home. And it's interesting, Elisha doesn't even come out of his house. He just sends a servant to the door. I don't know if the servant is Gehazi or somebody else, but he sends him out to give these instructions. And he says, I want you to go wash in the Jordan River 7 times, period. Very simple. Go out, go wash in the Jordan River 7 times. Now, Naaman has a big problem with this. He's a commander. He's used to getting respect. He's offended that Elisha hasn't come even to the door to greet him and show respect. And then he's offended that the healing isn't coming in the way that he anticipated. Remember what he said he thought Elisha would do? He said, I thought the man would come to the door and he would wave his hand over the spot and he would heal it. And Elisha doesn't do it that way.
No, he has a whole different plan.
He did. And there's nothing dramatic about it. There's nothing magical or mysterious or mystical about it. It doesn't seem supernatural at all. There is nothing in his instructions that would make him think that this is a supernatural event that's going to happen. I thought he would come out and stand and call on the name of the Lord and have this experience. And instead, a servant shows up and says, go wash in the river. Now, you have to remember, Israel compared to Syria, Israel is the conquered country. So it's like going into a third world country to a people that are lower than you, and then washing in one of their dirty rivers.
And he was used to the best.
He was used to the best of the best. In fact, he said, we have better rivers than the Jordan in our town. Why couldn't I wash in the better river? But see, he didn't understand the healing was not in the river. It didn't matter that his waters were cleaner or more pristine or appeared to be nicer. It wasn't about that. It wasn't about the Jordan River. It was about the freedom of simple obedience, the freedom of simple faith that always shows itself in obedience. And that's your handout, the line underneath the path to healing, is the freedom that he would find in simple obedience and faith. You know, God says that the work of God is to believe in him and on his son, Jesus Christ. That's the work of God. Simple, that we just believe him. And yet sometimes we don't want to. It seems like it needs to be more complicated or more dramatic, or there has to be something more to it. And that's what Naaman was really looking for. He was looking for a supernatural experience in a different way. He wasn't willing at first. And so God humbled him and again sent his servants to say, if he would have asked you to do something hard, you would have done it right away. Why not do the easy thing?
Try it. Could work.
It could work. Why come all this way and leave angry? And he listens to them. God gives him the grace to humble him and humble his heart so that he'll listen to his servant. And then he finds out the amazing piece of the absurdity of the gift. It doesn't seem like that's the way it should come, right? But he goes to the river and sure enough, he dips 7 times. And now the scripture doesn't give us any indication that while he was dipping that things got gradually better. It just says that after he dipped the 7th time, his body skin was like new. And so he had to, in faith, keep dipping the 7 times, even though he didn't see this progression happening, or it wasn't getting better. There was no hope that this was actually going to happen. But he does it, and he gets in this dirty water, and he washes himself 7 times, and then he's clean, and it's crazy. He looks at his skin, and he notices that it's like new. And it doesn't seem right that he would just be given new skin just because. He goes back to Elisha. Remember, he goes back, and he wants to pay for this gift. He wants to give him some kind of offering, some kind of gift as a way to say thank you. He's just so filled with joy, and he generously offers what he has. Now, Elisha has taken things in the past. If you remember our past stories, when we had the farmer who offered the bread, the barley, and the kernels of wheat, and he offered them to them. So people are bringing the prophets part of their tithe and giving them gifts. But this time, Elisha refuses the gift. And he keeps pressing Elisha. He says, no, take it, take it, take it. And Elisha says, as surely as God lives, I am not taking this. And it's this free gift that God offers the enemy, the freedom of healing and grace, just because he believed, just because he obeyed. And he got to see the power of God when he did that. And it just seems absurd that something like that could be free. But isn't that how grace is? God just offers us grace, not because we deserve it, not because there's anything good about us, not because we can offer anything back to him. He just does it because he loves us. And just like God reached out to the Phoenician widow, remember, that was in Sidon with Elijah, he reaches out to the foreigners, to their enemies. He reaches out to this commander, and he loves him, and he gives him this experience that comes through this painful discovery of leprosy. And he heals not just his skin, but you see this change in his heart, this grace of God that comes upon Naaman, and his heart is overjoyed. And not only does he know that there's a prophet in Israel, it's not about Elisha. What does he say? This is what his heart says in verse 15. He says, now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. Now I know that there is no other God, and he doesn't want to go back the same. And he says, I just ask that you would forgive this one thing, that when I kneel down beside my king and lend him my arm, that I would be bowing before this God, but my heart is not in it. I'm serving my king, I am not worshiping. And he takes back earth from Israel as a memorial that the living God lives in Israel, and that the living God is with him. Now, we don't need soil physically for God to be with him, but it's a symbolic reminder to him that God, the true God, is with him and not in the temple of Rimmon. Now, the absurdity of the gift gives us a glimpse of the generous heart of the giver that's revealed to us. God is so generous with us. I hope you see the generosity of God in your own life, that your heart overflows with the measure of his grace that he just keeps giving us when we least deserve it. Now we come to the last character, Gehazi. What was your thought on Gehazi?
It was going so good, and there was such a happy feeling. We have this new Naaman, and now we have Gehazi that has to leave us in the lurch here.
Right.
But hey, it obviously taught us another lesson about our little hearts that tend to look at things we maybe shouldn't look at. So go with it. Gehazi had he was coveting. He wanted what this guy had to give Elisha.
Yes.
And he thought, why shouldn't somebody get it?
Right.
Let's take advantage of this.
Right.
So I got him in a lot of trouble, more than he bargained for.
Yeah, and you would think Gehazi's been around Elisha for so long, and you would hope that God has done a work in his heart, that he would see God clearly, and yet Naaman actually sees God more clearly, I think, than Gehazi.
At this point, yes.
Yes. Gehazi's eyes are really on the material things that he can gain from this experience. He wants his share of it. He doesn't believe that an enemy of one of Israel's enemies, God's enemies, should not get off scot-free. If he's going to be healed, he should pay for it. And I should receive some kind of benefit from this situation. He wants to take advantage of God's grace. It's too hard for him to believe that God would just give it free. And he wants a piece of the action. And he does it in a very deceptive way. He goes out, he gets the stuff, the servants leave him on the hill, and he takes the things quietly into his room. And Elisha confronts him and says, where have you been? And when he lies about it, Elisha says, wasn't my spirit with you when you were at his chariot? And it reminds him that God has already revealed the sin. He already knows, and we can't hide from God. It reminds me of the story in the garden when Adam and Eve sinned, and they hid in the bushes, and the Lord called to them and said, where are you? It's like Elisha does the same thing to Gehazi. Where were you? Knowing full well that he had gone after all those material things that he saw as greater value than the work of God. He wanted material things more than he wanted God's presence and God's spirit. And the more that he wanted joy from those material benefits than the joy of seeing a changed heart. We see how greed really has a way of promising, right? There's a deceptiveness of sin. Promises something and it turned out to be his undoing. So number 6 on your handout is the disbelief of the servant. He really is upset that grace was given too easily. And he considers these earthly gifts of greater value than a changed heart. And he grudged his master's generosity. And so we see the deceptiveness of sin really allowed his heart to harden towards God. And it clouds his thinking, it clouds his heart. And what he thought would be gain for him turns out to lead to his greatest misery. And we see that now the leprosy of Naaman is now transferred to him. And he's now going to experience that destructiveness of sin in his own life. Maybe to humble him. And I don't know the end of the story for Gehazi. We're going to see him show up again. But he's going to have that visual reminder, that physical reminder of how sin will do that to our hearts. Just like leprosy will waste away our bodies and our skin slowly but surely, it does that in our hearts, right? When we allow it to sit, and especially the sin of unbelief, the sin where we resent God's grace, and we don't want to do that. We want our hearts instead to be like this slave girl, this kidnapped girl that had every right to be angry and to hold on to that hurt, that wound. And yet she submits it to the Lord, and through that she finds life and healing. And Naaman in his pride, who is humbled by his leprosy, and eventually comes to see God differently because he chooses to obey. He chooses to see and believe that God is who he said he is, even if it looks different than you wanted it to. And we see that Elisha Just like Elisha is able to take advantage of the opportunity, he sees that God is working, just like the girl did, just like Naaman did. God is at work, and he takes advantage of this situation to minister to Naaman, to a foreigner, to an enemy of God. So we want to walk that path, that same path to healing. Whatever God tells us to do, we just do, even if it doesn't fit our framework for how we think God should work in our life, or he doesn't answer in the same way. Like this girl's parents may have prayed for her return, and he didn't. But he answered, and he gave mercy on her. Maybe it looks different in your life. Maybe there's a wound that you have experienced that is creating resentment inside or hardening your heart. Or maybe sin has looked attractive to you, and it's hard to let go of that greed, that covetousness, that dishonesty. And we hold on to that instead of submitting that to the Lord. So we started with our big idea was an undivided heart follows God's path for healing. And God's path for healing is always the right path. He knows exactly what we need. And so we just need to follow him step by step. So our big question today is, where do you need healing? Where is that peace for you? Who do you identify with in this story? Do you identify with this girl? Do you identify with Naaman maybe? Or maybe the king in a crisis situation? Or maybe you identify with Gehazi in some way. Where is it that you need the Lord's healing in your heart? And what is the next step that God wants you to take? What is he asking you to do, and are you willing to do that? Eva, you had a really good question here that helps us to think through some of that.
Okay, what do you tend to struggle with the most? Fear, like Israel's king, anger and pride, like Naaman, resisting God's instructions, also Naaman, greed and honesty for Gehazi. And we're being sin nature that we have to guard ourselves from all those things.
Yeah.
And I love that verse in 1 John 2:15. Be on guard for the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. Yes. It's not of the Father, but is of the world. And I think we just have to always be alert to those temptations, because naturally we want those things, but we just have to go, nope, I don't need to be part of that.
Yeah.
But know that it's going to happen.
Yes, and it creeps up. You're not just done with it. It creeps in over and over. We have to be on guard and alert in our hearts, right?
Yes.
So on that big question, where do you need healing? What is the area in your life? And what is the next step that God wants you to take? I want you to think about that. I want you to pray over that this week and journal a little bit about that. Offer that to the Lord. And I want you to think about this third question. What opportunity is God giving you? Each of these characters faced an opportunity for God to do something. This girl took advantage of that opportunity by surrendering her heart to the Lord and giving him her hurts. And Naaman took advantage of the opportunity. It took him a while, but he got there, and he humbled himself, and he saw that it had great benefit to him when he just followed God's simple path. And Elisha took advantage of that opportunity, invited Naaman to come. He saw God was at work, and he wanted him to know there's a living God. But then we have Gehazi who did not, and we don't want to be in that category. So what opportunity is God giving you? Because the evil that causes the greatest misery will one day serve the omnipotent mercy of God, not just for you, but for the people that God has put in your life. That God's grace is so big, he can take those hard places, those crisis situations in your life, and use it for an incredible opportunity for his mercy to be on display. Let's grab hold of that this week. Let's surrender to God's plan. Let's lay down our own pride, and let's do the simple thing that he's asking us to do. It may be hard to forgive, and yet he's asking us to do that. Let's submit that to him. But let's walk in his ways, knowing that he's always at work, and he knows what's best, and he loves us so much. So I pray this week that you experience his grace, you experience his mercy in your life, and that your heart surrenders to him in all things. So we want to thank you for joining us this week. Yes. I hope you're encouraged by this story. We'll see you back here next week for more incredible stories about Elisha and what God reveals in 2 Kings 6, 1 through 23. Have a great week.